This is a rare opportunity. We don't usually get to be in the same place at the same time. You guys are in the same place. Where are you?
This is the DP Review offices and studio in downtown Seattle.
Nice. And how often do you guys get together in the studio?
On average, we spend about 1 week a month in here. I have to drop down a little more often if I have to run something through the studio testing or shoot some product shots. But our most productive weeks are when Mitchell's in town and we can hammer through some studio shots. We can shoot some video. About once a month.
And what are you
simultaneously most productive and most chatty?
What are you guys shooting this on right now? It looks very different from our webcams.
So this is the Canon EOS R50V. It's sort of a vlogging camera, but Canon, like with most of its newer cameras, has added the ability to use it as a webcam without any software or drivers. So we're using it along with a completely bonkers 24-70 f2.8 full frame lens, which is not a great match for this camera at all, but it's what we had to hand.
It works for today.
It works for today.
Okay, and a busy week for both of you yet again. Mitchell, you just published the Fujifilm GFX 100 RF full review. You want to start there? Some highlights for you?
It did. Wouldn't it be funny if we'd used that for the for the webcam? Except that
it might be a bit wide.
It might be, and it doesn't have the software. No, but that's not what that camera is for. That is sort of Fujifilm's. Hey, we've made a street camera and put a medium format sensor in it with this giant 100 megapixel sensor that they're using. It's from sort of the GFX 100 S2, but they've put it into a compact body with a built-in 28mm equivalent lens. And it's a really fun camera to use in like very specific circumstances, because there's a couple of things about it that make it, that I think Richard used this phrase, narrow the operating envelope of it, which is like a very nerdy way to say that if you are using it in situations outside of like bright light, you are going to struggle to get the most out of that sensor, because you'll have to be bumping up the ISO, because you can't use lower shutter speeds. It doesn't have a stabilized sensor, and it doesn't have optical image stabilization either. So it's just this very limited, mildly expensive camera that's very fun to use in a very specific set of circumstances.
But what it's worth stressing is that in that range of circumstances, so essentially daylight shooting, it is phenomenal. It's got a huge sensor, 44 by 33 millimeter sensor, and that's about 70% larger, so about 2/3 of a stop larger than full frame. If you're working in good light, the image quality is sensational. There is no camera that small that offers you so much image quality. So within its operating envelope, nicely sealed on the back with a stamp on the front, it is a spectacular camera in a format that's, I must admit, when I first saw it, I didn't think it was going to be particularly easy to carry around, but I think you've been using it more than me.
It's really, it's no more burdensome than like a regular interchangeable lens camera with a relatively compact lens on it, which is surprising, because if you look at sort of a GFX 100 S2, which does have a stabilized sensor, but with a sort of equivalent lens, it is much, much larger. And that is something that you would really have to think about carrying around. This, you can totally walk around with it slung to your shoulder, or hanging in a sort of crossbody bag, if you are comfortable carrying around a nearly $5,000 camera, which, depending on where you're going, may be a bit worrying, but yeah.
I saw some stark contrast between folks saying, what's the point of shooting a sensor this large if you don't have IBIS, right? And then other people saying, this is not for street or landscape photography. This should be in a studio.
I mean, like Fujifilm has essentially told us, yeah, the 100 series, like the interchangeable lens ones, are studio cameras. That's not what this is. And they, if you look at sort of their website and all the promotional marketing they've done around it, it's very clearly like they are saying, hey, this is for street shooters or documentary style, which is why they have put so much work into making it so compact. Mm-hmm. Like the lens is an incredible amount of engineering for a medium format lens.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great advantage to a camera with a fixed lens, is that you can build the rear element of the lens pretty much touching the sensor. So you can design an optic that fits much, much closer to the camera itself. and you can keep the overall package size down. Yeah, as Mitchell says, the mainstream GFX 100 series and GFX 50 as well are much more geared up for studio work. They have flash sync terminals. They have interchangeable lenses. You can adapt them to whatever you want to do. This is much more of a direct competitor to something like the Leica Q3 or the Q3-43. And again, those involve carrying, $6,000-$7,000 worth of camera over your shoulder.
Something around there, yeah.
Which I personally found a little bit uncomfortable when I was reviewing that camera. But there are people who are quite happy to buy a watch costing that much and wander around and think nothing more of it. So clearly, this is lifestyle goals.
A tax bracket speaking. No, it's funny because the GFX is a fair bit physically larger in sort of volume terms than the Leica, but I think it weighs about the same, which is sort of an indicator of how well built, overbuilt the Leicas are, depending on your point of view there.
But also, while this is taller than Leicas, the lens on the Leica sticks out a little bit more, I seem to remember. So overall, it's it's not like one is significantly easier to carry around with you than the other.
And a point about the Leica is that it is a full frame camera, not a medium format camera. The sensor is essentially the same exact pixels as what's in the medium format, just with the GFX 100 RF. There's more of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sony Semiconductor make a series of sensors based around a 3.76 micron pixel, because that's the sort of thing that my head is full of. And you can buy 26 megapixels of it, and it's APS-C. You can buy 61 megapixels of it, and it's full frame. Or you can buy 102 megapixels of it, and it's 44 by 33 medium format. In fact, there's also a 150 megapixel version, which is nearer 645, but frankly, nobody can afford that. But in terms of IS, I think it's an interesting one. That's very much why I've been talking in terms of operational envelope, which, yes, I know it's probably not the best phrase.
Sounds very military, like.
I think I have been reading about planes too much recently, but I think in good light, you can absolutely comfortably get the full 100 megapixel quality out of this camera without needing IS. If you've got plenty of light, chances are your shutter speed is going to be nice and high, and this will produce, just stunning image quality. And at matched ISOs, so in bright light, you're going to be able to shoot this and capture more light in equivalent terms than you can on Leica. So the peak image quality of this camera is beyond that of the Leica. Image stabilization is a question of, okay, as shutter speeds start to get shorter, as light starts to fall, when you start to worry about, handshake coming into it, and this is a camera you're going to carry around, so it is much more likely you're going to be hand holding this than have it on a tripod. It's just a question of how long can you hand hold it for, and while maintaining that full image quality. And the lack of IS for me isn't make or break. I don't think this camera absolutely has to have IS. But would it be more flexible if it had it? Absolutely.
And it is worth noting the Leica, the lens is substantially faster. I believe on the 43, it's like one of them has a 1.7 and one of them has an f2.
Yeah, the Q3 has an f1.7, and the Q3-43 has an f2.
Yeah.
And that means that as you get into low light, when you can't just sort of sit at base ISO, then that smaller sensor you're going to be able to put more light on that small sensor, and suddenly you're going to be able to initially close that image quality gap, and then you're going to be able to get better quality from the Leica. That's just the way that light works.
Because the GFX only has an f4 aperture, which is around f3 in full frame terms. Don't worry about it.
Right. People have fixated on that, right, as well. I do want to read one of my favorite comments from the week about IBIS. I won't say who, and this is a plug for anybody listening. The forums and our comment section on our articles is somewhere we like to engage quite a bit, as do many other people. And it can get heated. But on the subject of IBIS, apparently some have gotten so weak from sitting behind a keyboard all day that they aren't able to hold a camera still anymore. How did that one go over with either of you?
Listen, it's I hate it because it's true. No, so a perfect example is that I was trying to take a picture of this like very impressive building in really good light, but I had to have the camera down sort of at the ground level to get the angle that I want with the lens that I want. And one thing specifically about the lens is that it's a 28mm Quiv, and Fujifilm specifically said, oh, we made it on the wider end because that lets you sort of get away with slightly slower shutter speeds before motion shake from your hands starts to become evident. And I've seen people who have steadier hands than I get pretty impressive shots down at, lower shutter
More
speeds.
challenging angles and shutter speeds, sure.
Exactly. But I was trying to take a picture of this building. I couldn't quite hold the camera steady and see the screen because it only tilts up and down. So I ended up with a picture that has a fair amount of motion blur, not a fair amount, but like noticeable amounts of motion blur in it. Because I couldn't hold the camera steady at the angle that I was trying to get the picture at. And I think the stabilized sensor would have made up for that.
Yeah, and that's the point. It's not about, how manly and macho you are. It's not a competition. Simply whatever shutter speed you can hold, if you had image stabilization, you'd be able to go that little bit further. Whoever you were, however incredibly manly you are, you'd be able to extend the range over which the camera would work. I think it's hard to make a strong argument against IS being a good idea. And whether it's essential, that'll depend on what and when you're trying to use this camera. I don't personally feel it's essential, but it would be a more flexible camera if it had it.
And to be clear, this picture that I'm talking about came out well. Like if you printed it like relatively large, it would look totally fine. It's just when you zoom in, you see, oh, this is not as sharp as it could have been.
Sure.
And the wonderful thing about working at DP Review is that we don't edit, we don't crop, we don't try and manipulate the photos, and we try and make sure that every photo we publish is technically perfect, so it doesn't have handshake in it. So that image, may have been a really lovely image that you would quite happily use for your own purposes, but we wouldn't put it in one of our galleries because there will be people, who quite rightly, that's what the galleries are for, who will zoom in at pixel level and just go, well, that's not very impressively sharp. So we, because we present all of our images out of camera, full resolution, and expect them to be scrutinized, it is quite a weird way of shooting. So we have to have a higher bar, at least for technical quality, than most people would for their own photography. There's plenty of shots I've shot. Oh, I go, oh, that really like the shot, but I can't put it in a gallery. That's basically what my Instagram feed is.
Yeah, that's an important distinction as well. And we'll come back to that because I know that you also shot the Canon PowerShot V1 studio scene this week.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. But before we do, I do want to ask a question that came from the comments as well. Why couldn't it have a hybrid viewfinder?
So there's a couple of reasons for this. And one, the hybrid viewfinder they would almost certainly have to redesign it because it's a different focal length than it's a different focal length than the X100VI for sure. And there's also a couple things where Fujifilm think that the digital teleconverter, which is essentially a crop in on the sensor, and the aspect ratio dial are very key features of this camera. And those essentially make it so that you are using less and less of your frame. And if you're trying to compose that in an optical viewfinder, which cannot just magnify each time you do this, you're going to end up with an extremely small window in like the center of your frame that's essentially impossible to compose through unless you're using the electronic viewfinder. So it's sort of, they've built these core features into the camera, or they've made it core to this camera's identity, and then using the optical viewfinder, you couldn't use those features in a nice way. So I think that's part of why they decided not to do that, is because it just doesn't really fit with the other things that they're trying to do with this camera.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, we saw, I think it was the X Pro 3 got an updated hybrid viewfinder that's much more similar to the one in the X100. The earlier ones used to have, I think it's both the X Pro 1 and 2, had a slot-in extra lens, sort of magnifying lens that would slot in if you mounted a longer focal length on the camera, which sort of zooms the hybrid viewfinder in a little bit and means that it's more likely to cover the focal length range you're trying to cover. And it projects electronic bright lines into the finder to show you the current sort of field of view. To do that on this camera, where you're sort of cropping down to, what was it, 65 by 29 or something?
It's quite small.
It's a very very wide aspect ratio. If you then crop that in to use a very small area of the sensor, you've got a tiny little rectangle in the middle of your hybrid viewfinder that's not going to be especially usable. And anyone who's used I'm looking forward to the comments about saying this, just regretting it. But anyone who's used a Leica with a 90mm lens, a Leica M series rangefinder with a 90mm lens, will find that they're using a very small area of the optical viewfinder, and it's I'm going to argue not optimal.
And I've seen people argue, well, with the X100VI, it's got the same digital teleconverter feature, and you can crop in further, and that still has it. But I would say that feature is not as core to that camera's identity as it. One, because you're starting from a much smaller APS-C size sensor, so by the time you're cropping in 4 steps, you've got a pretty small area of the sensor that you're using that's not going to let in a lot of light. Whereas with the GFX 100 RF, you are using basically a 4/3 ish size crop of the sensor, which is still very acceptable. And there is not a non-customizable control point for it on the X100VI. Like there is a lever on the GFX 100 RF that is solely dedicated to using this feature. You cannot change it. So they've made it a very important part. They want you to use that.
Right. Yeah. The dedicated tactile control and having it be that function and that function only.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about how relatively easy it was to carry around, but then there's also the square hood that people are talking about, style, aesthetic versus functionality. Can you tell us more about your experience just actually using the camera in an everyday setting?
I definitely did not. I did not prefer to have the square hood on. It makes the camera look cooler, but it expands the depth by like a relatively fair amount. So it makes it bulkier, and you kind of hit it with your elbow if you have it strung over your shoulder. But for me, I mostly use this camera on vacation. So with the pre-production one, I took it all around Europe, and here I took it around the States, which was much less interesting. And I found it worked very well in that setting where I'm going out and exploring a new place and looking for interesting compositions and interesting things to take pictures of that I've never seen. And just having it sort of at the ready and being able to go, okay, here we go. Oh, I'm a little bit far back, but there's like a cable here because I can't get close to the Mona Lisa or whatever. So I can just punch in a little bit and boom, I've got the framing that I want. It adds sort of a bit of flexibility back to a compact camera that you generally don't have with a fixed lens model, because you have so much resolution that even if you crop in, you are still getting a very acceptable image. So like, you're getting a full frame image when you punch in once, and an APS-C image when you punch in twice. And as Fujifilm has shown, and Leica have shown, those are totally fine. So it's fun to have sort of this small camera. I did see someone saying that they should have put a zoom lens in it, as if that's feasible for a camera this size. I don't think it is, especially not with a medium format sensor. But just having that little bit of flexibility at the cost of some image quality for scenes where it was going to be exceptional no matter what I did, or scenes where, well, I have no other option. The option is punch in or don't get the shot. It was nice to have that built in.
I'd not got a lot of time in on the camera. I'm not a big fan of 28mm equiv, and I don't. My eye doesn't naturally compose to 28, and it's just practice. If you spend some time shooting with a wider lens, you get used to seeing the world in that way. So I'm not a big fan of 28, and what I didn't want to do is get this camera with a lovely big sensor, and then the first thing I do is pull the little lever on the front, knock it down to being a 35mm equiv, sort of full frame camera, and go, well, there are already cameras that I could do that on. It wasn't going to perform to its best in my hands, because the first thing I was going to do is throw away the main thing that it offers you, which is that honking great sensor in a small body. So I was just interested to hear Mitchell's perspective, having the note about accidentally catching the hood. I mean, the hood does look great, and if you're not, if you've got a shoulder bag with you, if you don't mind the bulk, I can see why you just go, oh yeah, no, I'd always have the hood on. But I'd be tempted to myself, because once you're carrying around that much bulk, you may as well go, commit to the bit and have it look as beautiful as it can. But no, I can absolutely see your point. It does make it that bit more awkward to carry around with you.
But it's still not bad. Like, to be clear, it's still better than a full frame camera with a big prime, or even it's not that big.
Last point of contention, as always, price.
It's expensive. It's, I believe, I don't want to get it wrong, I think it's $4,800. It is actually somehow, it includes a lens and is cheaper than a GFX 100 S2. So I have not checked. It is definitely one of the cheaper medium formats on the market. That does not make it cheap in absolute terms, because it is still quite an expensive camera. It's especially, and I was making this as we were discussing, sort of, yeah. So $4,900, essentially $5,000 when you get, well, it's way more than $5,000 when you get tax in, but that is still quite a bit cheaper than like a Q3, especially a Q3 43, which is even more. But for it, it's not going to be probably your workhorse camera. If you are looking to make money with a camera, you have much better options. However, if it's just going to be a fun camera and you can afford it, it is not so much more expensive than like a high-end full frame camera with a prime, with like a nice lens on it. That camera will be substantially more capable for other things. So like, if you're buying a Z8, you can shoot a lot more with it than you can with this, but it's going to be an entirely different experience. It's not as tactile. It's not as, when you're buying this camera, you are buying the feeling that you get using it. And for some people, that's really important. And if that's really important, then it's to you, then it can be relatively easy to justify that price. But that is what luxury items are, essentially.
Yeah, I think I've definitely seen, in fact, both on this review and possibly every review we're ever going to write at this point, where somebody makes the point, well, you can buy a Sony A7 CR plus, insert lens here. You can buy this package for the same amount of money and get that same capability. And I think that says a lot about the different ways different people see cameras. The A7 CR is a really fascinating camera, because it is probably the most image quality you can get in a small package for a comparatively low price. I think it's the lowest price camera to use that sensor. So you get this spectacularly good sensor in a small body, and there's the E-mount has lots and lots of lenses available. So if you just see your camera as being, well, it's a tool, it's strictly utilitarian, it's just about what can I achieve with it, then yeah, that is the most image quality for the least money in the smallest package. For some people, that will make absolute sense. But that isn't the only way to see photography. That isn't everyone's experience of photography. It's fascinating to see people who comment as if professional photography is the only kind of photography that exists. And it isn't. The vast majority of people who enjoy photography are not professionals and don't necessarily aspire to be professionals. In which case, achieving that shot, getting the perfect shot at the right moment isn't necessarily the end point. Enjoying the experience is the point. It's
right.
A hobby. It's meant to be fun. And And there is, some people say, oh, well, it's just a tool. It may well be to you, but that isn't necessarily true of everybody. And it isn't, and that doesn't have to be the case. I ended up having a discussion with somebody comparing something to a hammer the other day. And it's like, well, a hammer is, a hammer is a tool, and you don't, it doesn't make sense to spend 100 times as much on one hammer versus another, because, at a certain point, it's good enough to hammer a nail in. But hammering a nail in is the wrong metaphor. Hammering a nail in is, I need to achieve this one very specific task, and therefore I should buy the most cost-effective way of completing that task. Well, photography isn't a task. It's a pastime. It's something a lot of us do for fun. In which case, it's not about buying, the most efficient thing to achieve the task. If the task is, I just want to enjoy this. So I think, I'm absolutely not saying that, that perspective is wrong, but it is worth recognizing that it's not the only perspective. Otherwise, literally, we'd just say to everybody, oh, go and buy an A7C II if you need it to be small, or an A7CR if you need the higher resolution. Those are both good cameras. I don't particularly enjoy shooting either of them, but they are phenomenally capable. And if you are just trying to achieve something, great. But sometimes that's not what you want. And likewise, a fixed lens camera is not a less capable version of a less capable substitute for an interchangeable lens camera. Interchangeable lens cameras are great, and as you say, with a Z8, you can put a 70 to 200 on it, and you can go out and shoot sports. You can put long lenses on it and shoot wildlife, and you could. In fact, there's very little you can't do with a Nikon Z8 and some combination of lenses. It's a phenomenal, it's an amazing camera, but sometimes, the lovely thing about a fixed lens camera is, I was saying earlier that 28mm doesn't particularly work for the way I've trained my brain, but there is something lovely about having a camera slung over your shoulder that presents you with one view of the world, such that that's the lens through which you view the world, and you find yourself thinking, oh, is that a composition? As you wander around, you sort of see that composition.
Literally. Yeah.
You never have to stress, oh my God, did I bring the wrong lens? Oh, I messed up this choice. You didn't have a choice. You got the same. To wrap that up in a bow, like, it's funny because when I was shooting with the GFX 100R for the first time with the pre-production model, I also had a Sony A7CR with me. And the GFX 100R was so much more fun to shoot. It's got a joystick, it's got an autofocus joystick. It's got a much, much nicer viewfinder. The autofocus is not as crazy good as Sony's, but hey, that's just how it is sometimes. And realistically, it's not like the fastest camera ever anyway, the GFX is. So it works for what it's for. If I was spending my own money, I would absolutely buy an A7CR2 because or just an A7CR because I'm ruthlessly practical. But I totally understand why someone would look at that and be like, not for me. It's a little, it's a little boring, isn't it? And for that type of person, I'd be like, oh, sounds like you might want to buy a GFX 100. If you should look into that and read a review.
Yeah, there are a few things in the world I hate more than automotive metaphors. They're always so tempting, and I've definitely made them in the past. But if you'll excuse me, I'm going to make a bike metaphor because I know the three of us are all bike cyclists.
That's right, we are.
About 20 years ago, I found myself trying to buy a new road bike. A van driver had not done any favors to my previous one, but his insurance company was kind enough to buy me a new one, and I was over researching it. Has been known to happen. There's quite a good website for doing that sort of thing if you're into cameras, by the way. But I was over researching the hell out of which bike I should buy, and I very quickly came to realize that I could buy, if I bought a Giant or a Specialized, I would get the most possible specification for my money. And a good friend of mine said, is that what is that really the thing that's going to make you happy? And in the end, he was absolutely right. I ended up buying a lower spec bike from an Italian brand rather than rather than one of the sort of absolutely huge brands. It was lower spec, it was heavier, it didn't have nearly so many exciting carbon fiber bits. And about maybe 4 months after I bought it, spring finally came round, and I was sort of slogging up this hill in the sunshine, and I glanced down and saw the name of this Italian brand that's sort of evocative of sort of their racing success in the 60s, even though I'm never going to be a racer, and I'm terrible at it and don't really enjoy it. But I looked down at this brand, and I found myself smiling and just thinking, yeah, this makes me, this feels more special than buying the most sensible, the most bike I could get for my money. I would not look down, I've got plenty of bits by Specialized, but I would not look down at the top tube and see the word Specialized and go, oh yeah, and I think sometimes you need to step back and be honest with yourself. There are some things I'm ruthlessly pragmatic and just like, I want the most impact for the amount of money I'm spending. But sometimes it's worth having an honest conversation with yourself and just go, actually, would I appreciate how it makes me feel more than, slight difference in spec? I'm sorry for that tangent, but
and that's why most people considering this camera should probably also look at the Leica. I think that's that's probably all I've got to say about that. It's like, you can read more in the review, but basically, like, the Leica is going to have a wider operating envelope, and for some people will give them a much more special feeling because it's got the special menus, whereas the Fujifilm, you could get the same menus on an XM5. But for what it is, if this is the type of thing that interests you, I get it. It's not me, but I get it.
Richard, I want to talk about the Canon PowerShot V1. Your first time literally hands on the camera was back in January.
Yeah.
Tell us about when you first had it in hand, and then I'd love to hear about how much your opinions have evolved because you've spent a lot more time with it.
Yeah, this was an odd one because the PowerShot V1 is one of the first instances we've seen for a long, long time of a camera being launched just in certain markets and not in others. So we had this odd situation where it had been announced in Japan and Asia, but that we'd been given no dates and no details of it coming to North America or Europe, which is where most of our readership are based. So the CP Plus show in Yokohama was our first chance to see it. We had press passes, which meant we could get in half an hour earlier. So my colleague Dale and I ran across to the Canon booth, searched around, and managed to find a V1, grab it, and record something straight for Instagram.
And I do think the title was the world's first hands-on.
Yeah, and I think we titled it. We titled the video something like "Exclusive." We're the first to get our hands on the Canon V1, which is perfectly acceptable phrasing in British English. And we had a couple of comments that sort of said, "Oh well, it's not like you were going to get somebody else's hands on it." It's like, well, can you say we were the first to get hands on with? I mean,
people would. I've seen it written like that, but it's gross,
it's clunky. So
we get our hands on.
We were the world's first. They were our hands, and we did, we were able to sort of.
They were on the camera,
and they were on the camera. Yeah, we worked quite hard to try and put ourselves in that position, and it's nice to now have, it's great fun to be able to be the first people to sort of report on a camera, but it's also nice. In fact, it's a downright luxury to be in a position where we're able to stop, spend some time with the camera, really put some time in, really get a sense for what's it like to use in a variety of situations. We're not going to be the first. We're not going to be the quickest with our reviews. Plenty of people will call things a review on day one on YouTube when they've literally just held it, zoomed it a bit, read the spec sheet. That's not what we do. And it's lovely, it's lovely to be able to really get to know a camera properly before trying to pass judgment. And we very much appreciate that our audience is willing to wait. Now, we don't want to make them wait any longer than necessary. It's always a balance between trying to turn things around quickly, but we do very much appreciate that people do continue to come back and trust us to give a more considered perspective, because it's primarily a vlogging camera, but the whole idea of using a big sensor, it's essentially a cropped version of the EOS R7 sensor. A big sensor in a compact is a lot like the G1X series. It's conceptually sort of, well, what if we made a vlogging version of the G1X series? So we were excited about it, both for what it is, but also for what it could be. I don't know if you both remember, but about, I was going to say 5 years ago, and when my brain says that, the answer is probably 10 years ago. Nikon announced it was going to make 3 enthusiast compacts. This was at the height of the Type 1 sensor enthusiast compact era. I loved a lot of those cameras. It was going to make 3 large sensor compacts, and one of them, they were going to be called the DL series, and one of them was going to have an 18 to 50 mil equivalent lens. And the amount of comments that generated, there were clearly lots of people who really wanted a compact with an ultra wide lens. And unfortunately, they got as far as testing them. They were out with their sponsored photographers, and they showed mock-ups, I think possibly working demos at trade shows. So it was nearly ready, and they found a problem with it, cancelled the program, and none of those cameras were ever released. So all of a sudden, we've got a large sensor, and the V1 has a 16 to 50 mil equivalent lens. Not a very fast one, f2.8 to 4.5, but big sensor, wide angle zoom. Even if it's not designed first and foremost for photography, even if it's designed first and foremost as a vlogging camera, that's quite an exciting prospect for a lot of photographers. Was this finally going to be the camera that the DL 18 to 50 was hoping to be? And having used it for a couple of, probably a month or so now, no, unfortunately, is the answer.
And the backdrop here is that it's been a second since you've been able to buy a compact camera of any kind from Canon. Like the G7X3, I believe, is sort of their current model, and they've sworn to us and their investors that it is still in production, but it remains quite hard to get your hands on. So even if people are like, oh, this isn't exactly what I want, even if you weren't excited about the concept of a wide angle one, it's at least something that you might be able to buy. Although, as Rich is about to tell us.
Yeah. So as a vlogging camera, it is very good. And it's interesting. We've seen Sony, Sony has made 7 iterations, 7.5 if you include the 5A of the RX100 series. One of the first compacts to have a Type 1 sensor, much bigger sensor than previous compacts, a bright zoom lens fitted in your pocket, much better image quality than any compact had previously given. Absolutely joyless to use, but still amazing point and shoots, great travel cameras, swings and roundabouts. Oh, that's a phrase America doesn't use, does it? Okay. On the one hand, good. On the other hand, not so good. Pluses and minuses. But and that's very much where I've settled with the V1. As a vlogging camera, it is very good. Its stabilization in particular is better than the ZV-1 Mark II that is Sony's direct competitor. The point I was going to make is, they've made the RX100 series. They're quite hard to get as well. But Sony's focus has been much more on sort of basically vlogging variations of the RX100s, the ZV-1, the ZV-1 Mark II, the ZV-1F.
No, don't go there.
I have actually cornered a Sony Sony press representative and be like, listen, you need to fix the names of the vlogging cameras. It's a nightmare.
It is a nightmare.
So this is sort of Canon's alternative to the ZV-1 Mark II. They both have wide angle lenses, in part because you need to crop in to give 4K 60. So if you put an ultra wide zoom on the camera, then even when you crop into the 4K 60 region, you've still got something like a 23 to 72 mil equivalent lens. So it remains useful. Or if you apply lots of cropping to give you plenty of scope to sort of window around within the sensor to provide digital stabilization, you can crop a long way in and still have a wide angle field of view. The difference is Canon uses a much bigger sensor than Sony does, and that means in good light you get much better image quality. Unfortunately, it is a slower zoom, so in low light suddenly it starts to balance out a lot more. And also that sensor is not especially quick at reading out. So it is a little bit more prone to rolling shutter than the Sonys are. The stabilization though, and particularly that electronic stabilization, does seem to be really good. When we reviewed the ZV-1 Mark II, it was a little bit prone to sort of grab and release. As you started to move the camera, if you tried to pan, it would grab the scene, then realize you were trying to move and then jump, and then try and smooth things out. And
yeah.
It's a very difficult thing for the camera to know, hang on, is this intentional movement? Am I supposed to just let it happen? Or is it unintentional movement? Am I supposed to fight against it? It's, this is not an easily solved problem, but the Canon does really nicely in that regard. So, so really nice image quality, really good stabilization, but more rolling shutter. And it also has, the Sony has a mode called Product Showcase.
I believe that's Sony's name for it, because I always use it for everyone else's cameras. I'm like, God, wait, that's not.
Yeah, and that tends to be what happens. Everyone comes up with their own, often terrible names for features, and the first one to hit the market is the one that becomes embedded in your head as the generic term. But I think in the case of Sony, it's Product Showcase. And that's for when you're vlogging and you want to sort of show off a product, because there's it's capitalism after all. When you want to try and shill desperately for a product you're holding up in front of the camera, the problem was that face detection has got so good that the camera would not ignore your face. It would just completely ignore the product you were holding up or the thing you were trying to highlight, and it would continue to focus on the presenter's face. So Sony basically made a mode where the camera knew, actually, if there's something closer than the face, I should give emphasis to that. And it's a clever piece of looking at the way the cameras are being used and then modifying their behavior to make sure they do well at that task. It's not surprising we've seen other brands add a similar mode.
Yeah, I do. A note on that, I do also think it speaks to the fact that most of the time you might be by yourself. Right. So having that feature as a vlogger is extremely useful as a solo shooter.
Absolutely. As I've found, it's much easier to produce a video if you have, a Jordan to stand behind the camera, know the hell out of the camera and operate it for you. So you can just worry about actually remembering what your lines are, rather than trying to be single person, sort of presenter operator. So it's very much designed with that in mind. So the Canon has a comparable mode, but it's a scene mode. So it does a great job of refocusing and very quickly focusing back on the face when you take the object away. That side of it works brilliantly. But because it's a scene mode, all of a sudden you lose any control over exposure. So you have to press exposure lock if it gets it right, and then present. And you lose control over mic volume. So, if you're using an external microphone, well, you have literally no control over the volume levels. And so you may well, finally actually not stumble over your words, deliver your piece to camera, get into the edit, and all of the audio is blown out. So it's...
Ask us how we know.
Yes, and if it sounds like we're talking from bitter experience, well, you'll have to watch the video. But unfortunately, as a stills camera, I really did not enjoy using the V1. And I don't want to give away everything I'm going to say in my review and my video about the camera next week, but the controls have all of the flaws that the RX100's cameras did as an enthusiast compact. It's quite fiddly to use. I just kept running up against things that just made me just go, I just can't be bothered. It's fiddly, and it just doesn't have anything like the same level of direct control that a G1X or a G7X camera has. And I know that's not what it's trying to be, but for anyone who's out there thinking, well, I know it's designed for vlogging, but could I use it as an enthusiast compact? I'd say, well, yes, you absolutely can, but you have to really want that wide angle. If you're somebody who's been waiting all these years for something like, the Nikon DL18-50, then yes, this will give you, it's got a big sensor. The lens seems to perform really well. We shot the studio scene, and even at 16mm, obviously there's a lot of electronic correction going on in there to deliver a 16mm equivalent lens in a camera that can fit in your pocket. But the end results are really good. So if again, it comes back to the enjoyment versus practicality. How utilitarian are you when you're thinking about photography? If you like to shoot ultra wide angles, there is nothing, there's not really anything that comes close to this. And it will be worth putting up with the fact that you don't have a dedicated exposure comp dial. You don't have a clicking dial that can be used to set, F number, for instance. You'll probably happily work your way around those limitations. But as a reviewer, I'm not going to pretend those limitations aren't there. Sure, you can adapt to it. You can put up with it. But for me, if photography is supposed to be fun, you shouldn't have to be putting up with things. So yeah, it's very, very capable. If it's the only thing that offers what you need, and it may be, great. But it's not a camera I'd rush out and go, oh, actually, I really enjoyed that. Oh, I'll grab that. And I've gonna have to push myself to use it this weekend, because it's a combination of a wider angle lens than I would usually choose myself, plus kind of fiddly controls means that I haven't shot as many stills with it as I probably need to finish off the review.
How much indoor?
At least it's got a fan on it, though. So, if you're shooting at 500 degrees Fahrenheit.
I don't understand Fahrenheit at all, because I didn't grow up in the US, as you may be able to tell. And none of the rest of the world uses that scale. And I just refuse to learn it, because there's already a perfectly good scale that everyone else uses. But 500 sounds like a lot. I know enough to know that that's, hotter than surface.
That's the point where physics are not your friend.
But yeah, no, it does have a fan. As I say, it's aimed at vlogging. It's and the fan is very, very quiet, to the point where I'm sort of wondering whether it will have any effect at all, because it's you have to pretty much hold it up next to your ear to tell that it's working, even when you manually set it to its high setting. But yeah, it's
in theory meant to help with longer record times.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it almost certainly will at least do something, but especially if you combine it with sort of the say, hey, camera, sacrifice yourself on the altar of this recording. I don't thermal shut off as soon as you would.
I was going to say, I don't think you were saying you don't remember what every brand calls every feature. I don't think any of them have sacrificed themselves at the altar of longevity. I don't think it's the menu option.
The Magic Lantern people should get on that. Make that the option.
I was curious, Richard, how much indoor versus outdoor shooting you've done with it.
I've not done well. I've tried to do a little bit of indoor shooting, and yeah, that lens is f2.8 to 4.5. So as soon as you zoom in, you're going to, the aperture starts to close down, and the ISO is going to start ramping up. And I've got quite a lot of slightly smeary indoor photographs, and in an era where your smartphone already does probably 20-something milliequiv coverage, and is typically shooting 16 or 32 images and merging them, and so is giving you really, really good noise performance indoors. Yeah, it's a bit of a shock to be going, oh yeah, no, this is a appreciably smaller than APS-C sensor with a kind of pedestrian aperture in front of it, and oh yeah, no, that's why there's so much noise reduction in these shots. So as I say, not for me.
and unlike with those more photography oriented compacts that Canon's made in the past, you don't get a flash on this, or an EVF, which, you know, I've found at least having it up to your eye rather than having to use the screen to compose can at least help you shoot a tiny bit slower, just because you've got one more point of contact.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. And you know, I'm not a big user of flash, mainly because so many systems demand that you buy one flash for the camera, and then you can buy the external flash. And you know, we've always been in a position where manufacturers are kind enough to lend us cameras for the review process, but they don't always lend us the accessories. So we don't have easy access to flash guns for most systems. And I certainly don't have a flash that I can go, well, I'm using Fujifilm this week and Canon next week and Sony the week after that. I certainly can't afford to go out and buy the dedicated flash for each of those systems. I do love a bit of an external flash. I, you know, personally sort of, you know, camera in one hand, external flash in another, just to get that sort of offset position. It's great fun to do, but yeah, that's not where it's not really what the V1's trying to be.
No.
But having some sort of built-in flash would be handy.
It does have a leaf shutter though, so theoretically, maybe if you could, although there's a weird limitation, right? You can't.
So interestingly, there's been I got involved in quite an interesting thread on this. So it does have a leaf shutter, but I think the US, Canon US just says it has a shutter. Canon Japan's website appears to say it has an in-lens shutter, i.e. a leaf shutter, and Canon Canada says it has an electronic first curtain shutter. And as far as I can tell, they are all correct. It has a really bizarre combination of a built-in leaf shutter, but only for ending the exposure. It seems to use electronic first curtain to initiate the exposure. So which is weird because it means you get the flash sync limitations of not having a leaf shutter, but you get the maximum shutter speed limitations of a leaf shutter. It's a bit peculiar.
Cool.
So you top out at 1/2000th of a second, and there is a built-in ND. You know, particularly with vlogging in mind, it's built-in ND. So if you're shooting in bright light, you can still use a nice wide aperture. You're not that top shutter speed isn't too much of a limit. And if we try and do our rolling shutter tests, it just basically shows, oh no, it's basically instantaneous capture. So it definitely is using a leaf shutter. But as soon as you use an external flash, it's the same limitation as the G1X3, interestingly. You're limited to 1/400th of a second, not flash all the way to the top.
Which, you know, 1/400th of a second is nothing to sneeze at. It's not terrible.
No, it's not. But if you've, you know, most cameras with a leaf shutter, including GFX 100 RF, can sync, you know, up to or very close to their maximum shutter speed.
And that one has a built-in ND too, so theoretically.
Yeah. So yeah, you know, as I say, if you want that lens, then you know it will deliver. You know, the lens looks really quite good. If you have a look at our studio scene, we did include a version shot at 16 milliquiv. You know, it's a little bit bendy at the corners, and don't ever look at the RAW. It'll give you nightmares.
The uncorrected RAW.
Yeah, the uncorrected RAW will give you nightmares. But if you compare it to the final output, I think the sensible conclusion you'd draw is I'm really bad at predicting the impact on image quality of the fact that the RAW looked a bit bendy.
Wow, and 1,000 comments were born.
Yeah, but you could, you know, if you look at this RAW, you just think, that's terrible. This is pretty much a fisheye lens. You know, that's unacceptable. But in my opinion, if it gives you a useful, in fact, really quite good final result, the alternative is, well, you just don't have a lens that goes anywhere near as wide as 16, because digital distortion correction is the only reason we started suddenly seeing compact cameras that, oh, hang on, instead of starting at 33 milliquiv or 30 milliquiv, this one starts at 24. And in this case, 16 milliquiv. That simply wasn't possible before mathematical distortion correction became a fundamental way of fundamental factor in lens design. It is the thing that makes that lens possible. And the size, cost, complexity of it would rise spectacularly if you were to try and do that all in glass. There's no way it would fit in that size body or probably in your pocket at all. So, as I say, the raw looks shocking, but if you look at what that's then mapped to, it's worth realizing that actually it doesn't have nearly as much impact on image quality as you might assume it does. It's very hard to just look at a bendy image and go, oh, well, that's going to be terrible. May not be.
But feel free to play along. Like, you can go download the raws from our studio scenes and bring them into an editor and turn off the distortion correction and see what it looks like for yourself. It's fine.
Yep, we provided the raw exactly for that reason. But yeah, and if you don't feel that the end result is acceptable, that's
your decision.
That's your decision. That's the reason we present, and across the history of the site, the reason we shoot these test scenes and provide all of the raws and provide all of we show our working precisely so that you can draw your own conclusion. If you look at the 16mm equiv shot and go, actually that's not good enough for my needs, that's absolutely fair. But if you just look at how bendy it is and say, I disagree with the concept of this, I'm not going to take you very seriously in the comments.
That's when you'll get into it in the comments. Another reason to join the forum, so you can interact directly with Richard and Mitchell.
Only if you have nice things to say. No.
Okay, you hinted at this to wrap up here. You've got your review and 2 videos coming out next week about the PowerShot, right?
Yeah, so there'll be the full review, which will be based around a video about its performance for vlogging, because that's what it's designed for. And then we're hoping to, a couple of days later, follow up with a video about what it's like as a photography compact. We very much want to focus on its intended purpose first, before following up and going, well, look, if you're hoping it's something else, how does it perform? And I think I've sort of shown my hand at this point. Maybe given away a little more than I intended to, but hey, exclusive information here on the DP Review podcast.
That's why you gotta watch,
or whatever.
Don't call it a podcast. We're not.
I was going to say whatever the correct term is. But yeah, so those are coming up this week, and Mitchell and I literally to start this video, we have been shooting the Nikon Z5 II. A mixture of Nikon and Z. One day I will decide which side of the Atlantic I am. The Z5 II studio scene. So the review of that will be coming in the next couple of weeks. And then there's
XE5, which you can check out our thoughts about, like in the card there, because we've discussed that at length in this format. But yeah, we'll be giving that a full test as well, and then other stuff. X-Half, yeah.
X-Half.
Can't wait to see the studio scene for that.
Yeah, no, I did draw the short straw and say that I'm going to try and shoot the X-Half studio scene. That'll be interesting. And then the Panasonic S1 II. You shot the firmware for the S1R2 is out, allowing 8K open gate shooting. You've been shooting the video stills for that, so we can finally add the video section to our S1R2 video review. So there's lots of stuff coming up. There may be at least one launch on the horizon that we can't tell you about, but it's worth paying attention to the site, because that's where we'll cover them. Yeah, I think that's it.
Hopefully we'll see you back in the studio together real soon, and we'll be back to our little Zoom boxes the week after.